Okay, hello, everybody. I am Carol Stone, co-chair of the Environmental Concerns Speaker Series, and my co-chair Jeanette is right here in the room with me. And we have Matthew Shepard here in the center there, and he's the Director of Outreach and Education for the Xerces Society. He has been working for Xerces Society for more than 2 decades. His direct involvement in pollinator conservation in towns and cities is the thing that has sort of been a sustaining. He's worked on many, many areas of the work they do, which hopefully he will tell us about, but that has been a through area of interest for him. And he's the author of numerous articles.
Ada chinchilla, or one
I
other.
can't, sorry, I gotta turn this off. I can't take it. I apologize. Anyway, so his conservation career began, he worked on gardening for butterflies and attracting native pollinators. And he's a longtime editor of Wings, which is the Xerces Society magazine. And his conservation career began after completing a Master's of Science in Land Resource Management. And he managed a national trust in Oxfordshire and helped create Samphire Hoe. I'm sure I got that wrong, my pronunciation, but it's an award
correct
winning nature park at the foot of the White Cliffs of Dover. And after that, he worked in Kenya, and he met a Peace Corps volunteer, which resulted in his moving to Oregon, where they have 2 grown children. And I'll let you tell us the rest, Matthew.
Oh, well, thank you. I don't think there's much more to say. I'm not sure my life's been that exciting. I don't think I'll ever sit down and write my memoirs or my autobiography, and no one would be interested in reading. But nevertheless, thank you so much for having me here this evening. Yeah, I've been involved with pollinator conservation for 20 odd years, and conservation in general for 35, 36 years, something like that, since I left college. And for me, working with local communities, interacting with people, even though I've had the pleasure of going to some remarkable locations and spending time in beautiful places, it continues to be the interaction with people that makes it so worthwhile for me. So thank you so much for having me here this evening. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about pollinators, primarily bees, and I'll start sharing my screen in a moment, so you'll be able to see something more interesting than me. But I'm going to try and introduce you to the Xerces Society initially, because we do have a very direct connection with the Bay Area, and then I'll talk more about pollinators, their diversity, and in particular things that can be done in towns and cities to support them, because we do need them. They're just so fundamentally important to so much of our lives. There we go. Hopefully the sharing works, and now you can see my screen properly.
See it. Yes.
Great. So first, Xerces Society. We are a conservation nonprofit organization. We're based in Portland, in Oregon, which is where I am this evening. And the focus of our work is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. These tiny little creatures are of such vast importance to everything we do, the health of our planet, our health in so many different ways as well. And our name, which most people find it difficult to pronounce and find it difficult to spell, and yet once you've heard it, it's very difficult to forget. But we're named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which was one of the first butterflies known to go extinct in North America because of human activity. And it was last seen flying in 1943, and it lived on the San Francisco Peninsula. And as that city expanded, particularly towards the Pacific Ocean and the Golden Gate, all of the sand dune systems where the butterfly lived were built on, and it just disappeared. And this photograph on the left of the screen there, it shows a page from John Comstock's Butterflies of California, which is actually the only butterfly guidebook that I'm aware of that includes the Xerces blue. And you'll see, copyright 1927. About 15 years later, the butterfly had gone extinct. So we are, the Xerces Society is a conservation nonprofit. We do hands-on conservation. So we partner with farmers and public land managers and gardeners and park managers and all sorts of people to try and change conditions on the ground, create new habitat, expand the areas of habitat, and improve the management of existing areas. Because if we're not making a difference on the ground and making sure there are more places where more insects can live, then we're not having a huge impact. We also get involved in advocacy, because although we always prefer positive collaborations and partnerships, there are times when you have to stand up and say no, no, you can't do that. And most of our advocacy work revolves around protection of endangered species, trying to get them legally protected when necessary, and also pesticide regulation. We are also involved with research. We are a science-based nonprofit. Everything we do is founded in evidence, founded in science, so that when we're trying to protect a rare butterfly, for example, we need to have that information about its life cycle, its habitat needs, its distribution, etc., etc. That's part of our research. We're also involved with understanding the most efficient, effective ways to create habitat on a farm, for example, following organic methods. So there's all sorts of different ways in which we're directly involved with research. And then we do a lot of education, whether that's meeting with folks and giving presentations like this evening, or publications, or videos, etc., etc. Because although we are now a much larger organization than certainly when I joined, so much of what we do is through other people, and so we need to be engaging and connecting and providing those people with the information and the confidence to be able to take action. Moving on to pollinators, which I'm kind of nerdy, so I get all excited about bees. When we stop and think about pollinators, and just briefly, I mean, a pollinator is an animal that moves a pollen either within a flower or between flowers, and through that the flowers become fertilized and are able to produce seed and fruit. But the major groups of pollinators are insects. There are a few birds, such as hummingbirds, which are pollinators. There are, in the deserts of the Southwest, a couple of species of bats that pollinate, and elsewhere around the world there are mammals and birds that pollinate. But the huge majority of our pollinators are insects, and the major groups of those, just going from top left to right, are butterflies and moths, and then flies on the top right, and then the lower left, beetles, and then wasps and bees. And although all of these are important, it's bees that are probably the most important single group of pollinators. And there are three primary reasons for that, one of which is they're actively collecting and transporting pollen. The other pollinators typically go to the flower to feed. Sometimes they're looking for warmth or shelter, sometimes they're looking for a mate. But bees go and are purposefully looking for that pollen and collecting it and moving it around. they don't do this to help the flower, they do it to feed their offspring. And so they're working consistently from their nest, going out and around, foraging around and coming back, and foraging around and coming back. So they forage very intensely across this relatively limited area around the nest. And the third thing is that they, I mean, what we refer to as flower constancy. Basically, they're intelligent insects, and once they've worked out how to manipulate a flower to get the pollen out or to reach the nectar, they'll go back, because they'll go back to another flower of that same species because it's more efficient for them. So they can collect more quickly and gather the food they need to take back to their nests. And in doing that, the pollen is moved from flower to flower to flower of the same species. When we think about bees in particular, frequently the first bee that comes to mind is the honeybee. And although this is the kind of stereotypical bee, and it's the one that fills our kids' books, and you find pictures of them in household decorations and TV documentaries and magazine articles, etc., etc. And we think of queens and honeycomb and the different labor castes within the social structure of that hive. Honeybees are really not a typical bee. They're a very unusual bee. Most of our bees are solitary, so one female makes her own nest, and you don't have all of this social activity in these tens of thousands of bees in one whole colony. And the honeybees are hugely important to our economy, and particularly our agricultural economy. They are the bedrock for many of the harvests and many of the crops that are possible within conventional agriculture. But they're not native to this country. They were introduced by European settlers. They are beset by diseases and poisoning and poor nutrition and all sorts of things that are making it hard on honeybees and hard on beekeepers. But despite everything you may have read in the newspapers about honeybees disappearing, etc., etc., they're not going to disappear, because there are millions of hives in this country still, and they are maintained by the hard work, the investment of beekeepers. There are, beyond the honeybee, there are thousands of species of bees, and I just brought this slide onto the screen, and I'm sitting here going, this one's for Oregon, this is not for California. So I apologize for that. There are more than 3,600 species of bees in the United States, and California has the most diverse number of bee species for any state in the country, and it has about 1,600 species of bees just in California. And in a typical city, and this says Portland, but I mean, you could say Berkeley or San Jose or San Francisco, and you're certainly going to have 100 or 150 species of bees. And in a bigger city, and I would think in California, almost certainly more than that. There are some cities where there have been detailed surveys, and 250, 300 species of bees from one city, which is quite remarkable. And in a typical garden, you're going to have tens of species, dozens of species. And there are one or two surveys where people have found more than 70 or 80 species of bees in a single small urban garden. Now, just quickly kind of scamper through to give you an idea of what some of these bees look like. Bumblebees, we think of, in fact, it's interesting, if we think of a bee and bee biology, we tend to think of honeybees. But if you say to someone, can you draw a bee? They're going to come up with something like a honeybee, round and hairy and striped. And this is the yellow-faced bumblebee, which is one of the more common species that you get in the Bay Area. And then there are also, down where you are, you have these large carpenter bees, very similar to bumblebees, but not quite as hairy. And they don't have the yellow stripes on them. And then we have mining bees, which are another bee that comes out early in the spring, fairly nondescript, just kind of brown, not much that makes them very distinguished. We have mason bees, which are a little easier to identify because they have some blue color to them and some shine. And then there are some mason bees that are just bright green. We have sweat bees, also called furrow bees. And these are one of the more commonly encountered species and frequently among the more abundant. And they look a bit bee-like. I mean, they do have some stripes, but they certainly don't have the kind of yellow or that golden brown color that we associate with many bees. Some bees are remarkable flying jewels. This is a metallic green sweat bee, and these are amongst my favorite, and partly because they're such an eye-catching bee and they kind of challenge people's impression of what bees look like. And they're pretty common. We do get them in gardens, we get them in parks, and so it's an easy one to see. Some bees are much smaller, and if you see the scale of the flower that this bee is sitting on, this is a small sweat bee, and it's the same species of flower, and you can see this bee is, you know, less than 1/4 of an inch long. Some of these are down to 1/8 of an inch long. And so many of the bees that we encounter, including the ones such as these small carpenter bees, these are tiny, tiny little insects, and often they're moving around and they don't match our mental image of what a bee should look like. And so we're often not noticing them. We have leafcutter bees, kind of bee-like, striped, but not yellow and black. And you can see here on the underside of its abdomen, the yellow, that's the pollen. Although we might think of bees carrying pollen on their back legs, quite a few bees carry the pollen on the underside of the abdomen, just pressed between long hairs. And then we have long-horned bees. And the males have these extraordinarily long antennae, which they get their name. The females have much shorter antennae. And are really cute and hairy, and you just want to go up and pet them. And some people call them teddy bear bees because of that. So that was a very quick scamper through some of the commonly encountered bees in gardens and parks and cities. So to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about their natural history. Bees have a life cycle the same as a butterfly's, 4 basic major life stages. There's the adult, there's the egg, there's the pupa. If it were a butterfly, it'd be the caterpillar. Sorry, the larvae. If it were a butterfly, it'd be a caterpillar. And then you get the pupa, which is the equivalent to the butterfly chrysalis. And it's the same life cycle. Most of it happens out of sight to us. It happens inside a nest, and it takes about a year for this entire cycle to be completed. This particular example is a mining bee, and the adult is active for 3 or 4 weeks, and during that time, the female solitary bee, the female will make her own nest. In this case, she digs into the ground, makes a brood cell, does the foraging, nectar, pollen, puts it in, and then lays an egg on top of the ball of food that she has left. And then she seals the nest, and she'll never actually meet her offspring. That's the end of the contact she'll have. The egg hatches within about a week. It spends about 10 days, 2 weeks eating that food in the nest, and then the larvae will transform into the pupa, and it will remain dormant within that nest for the rest of that 12-month cycle, and will emerge the following year at the same time that their mother was active. About 70% of our bee species in this country are just like that mining bee. They nest in the ground. And so all these bees need is access to soil. And it doesn't have to be bare ground. It can be patchy grass. It doesn't have to be a big area, but they do need access to that ground. And depending on the species, they may go down 4 or 6 inches depth before they brood cells, but others will go down 8, 10, 12, 18, 24 inches deep. Quite remarkable engineering skills and construction work going on. under our feet, quite literally sometimes. Most of the rest of our bees, such as mason bees and leafcutter bees, they don't make their own tunnel. They occupy an existing tunnel, such as an old beetle tunnel in a dead tree, and they divide that tunnel up into a series of brood cells. The two diagrams there, the top one is a leafcutter bee, neatly trimmed pieces of leaves that it stitches together to make a little totally enclosed cell, which has got the food and the egg, and then subsequently the larvae and the pupa in it. And the lower one is a mason bee, builds walls out of mud that dry and divide up that tunnel for its eggs. Those tunnel nesting bees need these nesting materials to go with that. Sometimes it's a leaf piece, like this example of a leaf cutter bee carrying her leaf piece to the nest. Others, it's wet mud or resin or little pebbles. Sometimes it's other leaf parts, chewed up leaf pulp and so on. And so all sorts of things that the bees need to make their nests. And then the third major group of bees are bumblebees, and they are social, not at all the way that honeybees are, and certainly not in colonies as big as a honeybee hive. But the bumblebees, they need a small cavity, such as an old nest, an old mouse nest, or a chipmunk nest seems to be really popular. Sometimes it's a gap or a void underneath tumble down vegetation, all sorts of different possible places that they might find. And then the queen emerges from overwintering, hibernating, and founds her nest. And through the year, successive broods, you get gradually more and more bumblebees. And a healthy bumblebee nest may have 80 or 100 bumblebees in it by the end of the year. Some species you may get 200 or 300 bumblebees by the end of the year, but most species are much smaller. And then the other thing that bees need, obviously, are flowers. And this may seem like a kind of a duh moment, like, well, obviously bees need flowers, but some bees are much more particular than others about which flowers they will collect pollen from. And so what that means is when we have such a diversity of bees, we need to ensure that we have the diversity of flowers to support them. That's all I'm going to say about the kind of natural history and so on. There's lots of information out there. You can find books, and these are 3 books that I have found particularly useful. Attracting Native Pollinators, which I admit I have a personal interest in. The Bees in Your Backyard in the middle there is a fantastic book if you want to do a deeper dive into bees. And then Thor Hansen's Buzz is just a great romp through the world of pollinators and pollinator conservation. So moving on to what we can do. I mean, I could talk about threats, but I mean, the major threats are loss of habitat, insecticide use, and increasingly now climate change. Climate change is one of those overall issues that affect everything else. But for insect pollinators, loss of habitat and pesticides are the major threats. And we can do things about that. If we can create more habitat and make sure the habitat is safe and clean from insecticides, then we certainly can be supporting our bees. We need to be ensuring that that habitat supports that entire life cycle. So it needs stable, secure nest sites. It needs the flowers that the bees can collect nectar and pollen from. We like to have it safe and protected from pesticides. And then the other principle that we like to work with pollinator conservation is engaging your community, because you might do one thing, but if you've got 10 people doing it, or your entire city doing it, then you can imagine just how the impact multiplies. And I was saying that, I mean, the threats, all of those threats, I mean, making sure this habitat obviously deals with the habitat loss. Making sure that habitat is safe and protected from insecticides deals with poisoning of bees. But the habitat also helps address climate change. Nature-based climate solutions, i.e. making sure there's enough habitat and green space, does absorb carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and it also creates the places where, as climate changes, as things warm, as wildlife moves, changes, ranges, etc., etc. If the habitat's there, then there is somewhere where it can move, both around cities, but also through cities. There are examples from Europe where in the Alps, the mountains of Switzerland, as the temperatures are warming, insects are going higher and higher up the mountains. And there's studies have shown that when there's a town in the way, the insects don't go up the mountains and they go up the other parts, and then they're not in the higher areas behind. Whereas when there are adequate habitat corridors through the towns, then these insects manage to migrate upwards successfully. So something as simple as habitat really does have an impact. The habitat needs to include the nest sites, both, dead trees, bare ground. A lot of this is kind of untidiness. Frequently we're trying to make our landscapes look pretty, look tidy, look acceptable to people, but we need to be bringing some of that untidiness back in and keeping these kind of scruffier areas. With nesting, we can also be making nest blocks. You see them in garden shops, in nurseries, etc., etc. But it's always better to retain these more natural nesting areas. But when there's no chance of natural nesting areas, these artificial ones work well. We also need to be ensuring that there's adequate forage patches, keeping the flowers that we have, creating new patches, expanding. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests that locally native plants are better. And where you are, Gordon Franke at UC Berkeley has for years been doing an amazing project where he's recording the flowers in various towns and cities through California, and also the bees that are using those flowers. And he's built up an amazing body of evidence that shows that non-native plants can help, but native plants are better. Avoiding pesticides is obvious, and although you can, there's lots of rules, but basically don't. I think that's the most straightforward guidance I can give on pesticides. And I know that there will be some times where maybe you have a specific pest that could be damaging and might need controlling. And so there may be times when insecticides are okay. But in most situations, many of the insecticides that are used, particularly in gardens and urban areas, are cosmetic uses. People don't want their plants looking a bit tatty. They don't want their plants looking funny colors. And so if we can avoid that, then we're creating a landscape that's much healthier for bees. And the last thing I want to touch on before I move into the next section, when it comes to bee conservation, and we hear the tales of declining, disappearing bees, it makes sense that you go, oh, well, if we don't have enough bees, we should get more bees and bring them in. And so quite a few people have taken up beekeeping, particularly on a small scale. But beekeeping isn't necessarily bee conservation. Bringing in boxes of bees into an area which is already not supporting the bees, is just adding more bees and adding more competition, because there very definitely are competition issues between the non-native European honeybee and all those native bees that are trying to survive out there in our landscapes. And so there are reasons for having honeybees, but don't do it because of bee conservation. Bee conservation focuses on the habitat, making sure the landscape can support the bees, making sure there are adequate flowers, making sure the plants are protected from insecticides. All of that will support our bee populations, whether it's non-native domesticated honeybees or wild bees. But moving on to look at how those, we've seen the bees that live in these areas. We've got an idea of the kind of things we can do. So let's take another look at, or a further look at what can be done in specific locations. I want to pause. This photograph you may recognize is part of San Francisco. That's the Golden Gate up there on the upper part. This is also what the last home of the Xerces blue butterfly, this region. This is a sunset district in the foreground, and then Golden Gate recreation area over there in the distance. And this is the area where the Xerces blue butterfly used to live. One reason pollinator conservation works very well in urban areas is because bees fly. I don't know, it's kind of obvious, but it's good to know, because what that means is you might have a small patch of land, but that patch of land doesn't have to provide everything the bees need, because you have a small patch of land here and a small patch here and another patch over here, and the bees can move between them. And so you might have the great nesting areas in one patch, that dead tree, the snag by the creek, or the bare ground on the creek bank. And then the plants could be in the gardens a couple of blocks away. The plants could be in the park just over the other side. So because bees can move around, it means that they can utilize all these different little patches and little bits of resources that any neighborhood can offer, whether that's a park or a roadside or community garden, a garden, a private garden. All these different things can together can combine to provide all that bees need. And one reason we need to be working to put lots of little patches is that many of our bees can't fly very far. And a big bee could fly a quarter of a half a mile, maybe a mile, and honeybees will fly that far when they need to. But if you're a tiny bee, an eighth of an inch long, or even smaller, some of them, they frequently don't fly more than maybe 100 yards. And that's just the limit of their flight ability. And so, that means that they may only live within a couple of city blocks. And that's their entire range. It's as far as they'll go in their entire lifetime. And so we need to be getting all these little patches of habitat everywhere we can into our blocks. And obviously private gardens are a great place to start. So many possibilities, from flowers, for nest sites. We can manage these gardens very, very thoughtfully to try and provide the range of flowers that will provide bloom and therefore nectar and pollen, foraging opportunities for bees all the way through the year, from the beginning of spring through to the late summer. And also, one of the great things about private gardens is these are often areas where we have more possibility of getting a little bit of chaos, a little bit of untidiness in, because there are fewer expectations on what you should or should not be doing. And I know there are homeowners associations, and they can be pretty rigid and problematic when it comes down to trying to get habitat in. And my own personal attitude is I don't think anybody should be outlawed because they want to help wildlife. But I'm also not naive, and I know that some of the homeowners association rules, and even in many cities, have weed regulations that limit the height of grass and so on. But as long as your garden looks tended, it's amazing the richness of habitat that you can get into it. Many houses just outside the garden, they have parking strips, that little bit of greenery down the side of the road. These are recognized as being terrible, horrible places to try and grow anything and take a lot of thought. In fact, some people refer to them as hell strips because of that. But they do provide an opportunity, either because you've got another place where, you could plant a tree with a great flowering bloom to it. You could take up the grass and have a burst of bloom in there. But if it's a really terrible area for growing, you could focus that area on providing nesting sites. You could create a situation where there's bare ground that the bees could be nesting in. You could have rocks and logs in some of these areas, both to fill the space and to provide some visual interest, but also will help to provide habitat. Education gardens, school gardens, these can be really fabulous habitats, supporting a range of bees with having that diversity of flowers. They do have their own particular management challenges because, you know, like during the summer, people aren't around to weed and maintain. So you might want to, if you are working in an education garden, think about the times when the children are going to be there, and there can be more activity and focus the bloom on those areas. Many education gardens, people like to grow food plants, which I completely understand because it's great for kids to have a connection, understanding where food comes from. But many of those, the harvest is during the summer when no one's around. So, you know, all these different issues with different locations. But they also really provide a fantastic opportunity to integrate pollinators and gardening and plants and you know, the environment into classroom curricula, whether that's math or creative writing or art or science or all sorts of possibilities. There are also community gardens. These provide you know, both a community building opportunity and a possibility to help address food scarcity for some families. But you can also introduce pollinator habitat into these, either through the plants that are being grown, you know, sunflowers, amazing plants, great pollinator plants. But also I know of some some community gardens that have a dedicated plot that is managed by the garden volunteers as a whole, and is just there as pollinator habitat. And again, another public location, a great opportunity for education and outreach. You can use pollinator habitat for street landscaping. You know, pollinator habitat is inherently full of flowers, so it is beautiful and attractive. And so you can combine attractive plants and choose the ones that will be supporting pollinators. And it also is an opportunity to bring habitat into densely developed areas. Sometimes this kind of street landscaping can be the only flowers, the only greenery in otherwise drab landscapes. I don't know, I mean, for just recently, unfortunately, for many years, how to manage stormwater has not been a big issue down in the Bay Area, but I know right now you've had storm after storm after storm. And so increasingly now, communities are looking to better ways than simply pipes and moving that water off. They're looking for ways to filter the water, to hold it. These can help deal with both reducing flooding and reducing pollution from runoff from roads and parking lots and so on. But bioswales also provide a great opportunity to bring flowers into the landscape, and often because of their intended purpose, they're slightly wetter, so that you've got a chance to. Often this increases the bloom period of flowers, and so all sorts of things, asters and many other plants will grow very well in those situations. Office landscaping is another way, and frequently this has been you go down there, it's like a few ornamental bits of grass and some bedding plants, like the annuals that they bring out, petunias and whatever else. But you could make that into an area that really does bring life to the office. Native species, the big leafy plant there is milkweed for monarch butterflies. And again, because these are more formal landscapes, they're often areas where there's irrigation already installed, and so that gives you an opportunity to lengthen the bloom period in dry areas. College campuses are another place you can be bringing bloom and beauty in. You can design the planting programs and the planting schemes so that there's bloom in the major times when the people will be around. Maybe in the summer when families are visiting, all excited about their kids heading off to college in the fall. You could do it during graduation season. You know, you can make sure that there's all that late summer bloom when the term starts at the end later in the year. And many college campuses, like cities, have climate goals, and these, you know, pollinator habitat can help you address those climate goals. And you probably realize this is UC Berkeley. I tracked down a photograph for you, so there you go. It's habitat for pollinators doesn't have to be at ground level. Green roofs are increasingly coming in for lots of different reasons, for managing stormwater, for added insulation, because there's also an opportunity to create an attractive space, you know, improve that view from the window, or have a rooftop terrace where you can have your lunch or study. And green roofs for a long time were pretty much considered, you know, sedum, a little thin mat. But now people have begun to realize that if you plan it, you can have a complete habitat on the green roofs. You can have deeper soil areas, which allows for ground nesting bees. You can have logs, you can have structures in these areas. You can have native plants that can grow very successfully up in those remarkably harsh extreme conditions. But this is another way to bring green space and habitat into really densely populated and densely developed areas. Obviously, back down on ground level, parks. You know, we might think of parks as recreation grounds or lawns, but increasingly they're being rethought, and you can bring habitat back in. This park is actually in Portland, and it was intended to be a chance to recreate an area of, you know, prairie that represented the vegetation that was there in this neighborhood before it was built up. Playgrounds are being reimagined. Nature play. People recognize that time spent among greenery is great for emotional, not just physical, but emotional and mental health. And so, you know, now this is a playground where there's the more typical structures, swings, climbing frames, slides, but they daylighted a creek right alongside of it and made sure there was a connection between the playground and the creeks. And our kids can go and play in the muck, build dams, pretend they're beavers. They have meadows where the kids can crawl through. And so all of these are being done for recreation, for the community benefit, but you can design habitat into them. Corridors, walking trails. This again happens to be San Francisco. These are the tiled steps at 16th and Morega. But it also, the vegetation up the side of that is part of a citywide project to support the green hair-streaked butterfly, very specifically designed into this area. And so these areas that are seen as connectors or recreation, and often pretty small, narrow, they can be really significant in creating corridors for pollinators, which are small, so will thrive in these small areas. Wetlands and riparian areas, again, a linear feature running through our built areas. Often these are places where you can get more undisturbed areas. And although many of them, as you can see here, this is in the South Bay area, this creek has been so heavily engineered, it's essentially an open pipe. You know, they just to move the water as quickly as possible away. But there is some green space around it, and you know, some of these bigger plants, some of the earlier blooming willows and so on, that brings bloom and habitat into our areas. And so we can look at these areas and we can think of them as so much more than just a water channel. We obviously have nature reserves. We should be protecting these. This is an area where, or a place where we really should be focused solely on native plants and getting some diversity of habitat back in. And this is also an area where I would always encourage people to not add honeybee hives. Frequently people will go, oh, we've got this natural area, we'll put hives on there, it'll be good. And hives are just introducing honeybees that are competing with native species. And then, you know, a few other areas that are often not thought of as habitat or as great benefit to wildlife. Utility rights of way. These are, I mean, we all know the problems with utilities and tall vegetation, starting fires or damaging the power cables, which means that they're perfectly adapted for open, sunny, low vegetation, extensive meadows, maybe some shrublands, but all sorts of great possibilities for utility rights of way. When we also have roadsides, whether it's a suburban road or you know, a more significant thoroughfare. Again, these are areas that cut through our densely developed areas, and frequently they do have vegetated roadsides, and you can manage those sides. Tradition has it that for many of these areas you just mow them. But you don't need to mow them. Obviously, there's certain safety requirements, and you'll want to keep the vegetation low, but elsewhere you can have higher vegetation. And certainly California has a very active program of getting native plants onto roadsides. And sometimes it's not necessarily planned, like this photograph here. This is wild licorice growing. Amazing plant, robust, and will grow literally out of the concrete there. And it's just, sometimes we have to tolerate the weedier plants that are surviving, and they can bring benefits to us all. And then the very last one, railroads, similar to our highways, running through, you know, dense areas, trashed agricultural lands, wherever, but can have significant areas of green space alongside them. These can support really diverse, extensive wildflowers, given the chance. Herbicides are a particular challenge. Again, like with power lines, there's always going to be a slight fire risk with a railroad. And so they do run trains along from time to time, just spraying out either side. And it's harder to see, but this is all showy milkweed, and the top part closer to the rails is yellower and browner and not looking so healthy. That's the herbicides. So again, it's a question of changing management practices and changing expectations to hopefully give the plants a better chance, and accept that you don't need to completely destroy the vegetation down the entire width. So that's a bit of a canter through to give you an idea of the opportunities that exist in urban areas. As an individual, there are, you know, if you have a garden, there are numerous certification or other programs out there. Audubon Society's Habitat Gardens, the Million Pollinator Garden program. We have our own Bring Back the Pollinators program. We don't come and check up on you. It's all on honesty, but it's the same principles of making sure you have the flowers, the plants, avoiding pesticides, and sharing the words. We also have, if you want to do something at a community level, whether that's you know, a city or a campus, we have the Bee City USA program, which we didn't create. It was actually created by Phyllis Stiles, who started it as an individual in Asheville, North Carolina, back in 2012. And after about 5 years, she was finding it was too much, and her husband really wanted her to actually retire. So she came to us and asked whether we would take over Bee City from her. And of course we said yes, because it's amazing. And it's a certification program that is applied at the entire community level. The same principles of plants and habitat and avoiding pesticides and outreach. And the affiliates commit to doing these things. They commit to, you know, doing at least one habitat project each year. They commit to reducing pesticide use. They commit to doing at least one outreach activity in the year. And it may not seem much, but if you're doing that bit by bit, and it varies, some cities are small and that's all they do. Some cities are big and do incredible projects and huge numbers of outreach activities. But we now have more than 320 affiliates across the country in 46 states. And right around you, UC Berkeley is a bee campus. And then across the bay, University of San Francisco and the College of San Mateo are also campuses. And San Francisco, the city itself, is a bee city. And then there's a couple of others a little further north and south from you. But we're building this nationwide network of communities dedicated to protecting pollinators. There's also community science projects that you can participate in. Simple ones where all you're doing is taking photographs of bumblebees and submitting them through a website or through a phone app. Some, such as the Bumblebee Atlas projects, takes more commitment from individuals, and we train people to go out and do it. Other organizations have projects such as Journey North, which is monitoring monarch butterflies, and the Great Sunflower Project, which is run by Gretchen Laboon at California State, San Francisco State University. Sorry, I should be remembering her university. But it's an amazingly simple, all you do is you go sit in your yard for about half an hour and report back on how many bees you see. Take your cup of coffee out there, or your cocktail or your lemonade or whatever it is, and just go and enjoy your yard. And it's amazing how much data can be collected, and all of that information is fed back into building more understanding of the insects we're trying to protect, and informing conservation work too. Just to wrap up, there's lots of books out there, both books that Xerces has produced. You can buy them, you can find them in your local library, but there's also an ever-growing number of books about understanding bees, about plants, about gardening, etc., etc. There's a wealth of information available. You can go to our website, xerces.org, and you can download plant lists and conservation guides and all sorts of information for free. If you're not a reader and you prefer to watch, and I know that people have different learning methods, our YouTube channel has videos and webinars and all sorts of resources that might be of interest. You can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We share information, we share hints and tips, we share new resources, we have conversations about conservation work. Xerces Society is a donor-supported organization. If you're already a member, thank you so much. That's so valuable and important to us, and I really appreciate it. If you're not, I hope that you might consider supporting our work. You can just go to our website and you'll find lots of information there. And that's the end. Thank you so much for your patience as I work through that. I would always much prefer to be in the same room as you, but Zoom is an amazing tool and does allow us to connect and talk over such a long distance. If you have questions, I'll hang out and do my best to answer them. And for the moment, I will stop sharing.
Gail.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I have been so worried about the bees and the pollinators for years, and I have a wonderful yard, but I'm definitely going to look into your website and for books to make sure I can put more plants and so on to attract, although we have hummingbirds and bees and bumblebees, and I'm very lucky to have that space here in San Francisco. So I suppose that's about the best thing I could do for now. I just wanted to say thank you for this presentation. It's very thorough, and I learned a lot from it. Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I have a question. We have a large yard. It's sort of solid soil and redwood trees. and deer.
Mhm.
So most of the things that you suggest are not things that are likely to survive in our yard. They change their habits every year, but this year they've eaten all of the tops off of many of my plants, and they've
Mm.
eaten a lot of the the undergrowth of leaves, not leaves. They're just they're a type of well, oh, forget it. It's just a type of plant that has a lot of growing along on the floor of the ground, and they have eaten that. And so all we see now is sticks. So I'd love to have some suggestions of how to make it so that we can cohabitate between us.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know your gardening well enough for that region to really be able to suggest specifics.
Right.
The best suggestion, in my experience, master gardeners are wonderful people to get to know. I know we certainly have some amazing master gardeners in our county. And there are networks of master gardener programs across the country. They're run by the Cooperative Extension Service, which I think the master gardeners may well be run by UC Davis in your part, but I could be wrong about that. But you should find an extension office in your county, and through them be able to reach out to the master gardeners. They are just, I mean, in my experience, they're very knowledgeable, and their sole reason for existing is to help people. And they, you know, things like which plants may be more resistant to your deer, they're the
Right.
people who will have that kind of information.
Great.
And wouldn't that be good for nesting and so on, ground that was uncovered and just sticks and so on, potentially?
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly does. And you mentioned the redwoods, and the duff from the redwoods is the kind of place where bumblebee queens will overwinter through the colder months. So there are some benefits, but I also understood that you really wanted flowers. So
Well, I do want flowers, but I not necessarily under the redwood trees. But
sure.
it's also, the soil is actually very solid because it's basically the same kind of soil as is in the mountains around here, but it's all ground up into small pieces, and it comes out kind of looking blue when you bring it up. So it would be a situation where we would have to add additional soil type or something to really get it.
Probably, if you want for plants, you probably want to work to improve the soil, adding compost and whatever else.
Right.
If it's for ground nesting bees, there are things you can do, and people have tried creating specific areas for ground nesting bees by, creating digging out a larger pit and putting in a sandy, loamy soil mix, for example. And on the whole, our native bees do seem to prefer sandier soil. But I also know that bees will dig in whatever soil they have locally.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And so, I mean, you can go to all that effort to try and create this ideal seeming nest patch, and they'll ignore that and nest in the scruffy bit next door.
Okay.
There are several schools I know of that have baseball fields, and I don't know what they make the baseball diamond out of, but mining bees love it. And that's a bit of a conundrum for some of the schools,
Ooh,
because
yeah.
come April, there's thousands of bees active in their baseball, their softball diamonds.
Carol has, but you're unmute. You have to unmute yourself. You have a question, your hand up.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Hi. Hi, Matthew. So, yeah, I do the monarch count and have for several years. I live in Albany and we have Albany Hill, which is a wintering site,
Yeah.
and I am a member. So
Okay.
we have been, we've had all of the butterflies on Albany Hill besides the monarchs have identified the host plants. I was glad to see one of your slides mention the host plants. So we're emphasizing that because we don't really want people to plant milkweed in the Albany area because of the wintering site. So so we painted a mural on the school at the retaining wall at the eastern foot of the Albany Hill. And we featured the host plant for the butterflies that are up there with a butterfly beside it. And now we are just starting to do a demo garden behind the mural so we're planting the host plant that was painted. We're planting it right behind. And yeah, the deer, it was a great year for gophers last year. They just went wild in the whole area of my neighborhood. And so we're using little baskets, these metal baskets that we got at the Westway Nursery. I don't know how it's going to work for some of the like shrubs, like the the Sierra plum and the coffee berry and some of those that it might constrain the root ball to have that basket. But I think we need to do that at least to get them started because of the gopher.
Yeah, I mean, if they're a problem, then there certainly should be steps you can take to protect the plants or to deal with the gophers. But if there's a lot of gophers around there, you could be getting rid of some and they'll just move in from next door.
Well, it's because of oxalis is the big thing. They love oxalis. You know, that's
and
just
you probably can't get rid of all the oxalis, can you?
oxalis is just taking over the Bay Area. I just don't know what we're gonna do about it. It's definitely invaded Albany Hill, which has all these native plants that have been there for years and years. And then we have deer too, but we have a volunteer who has fenced around the plants. So the deer and the turkeys.
Turkeys.
They both like to take off the flower thing. So there are challenges, but we're doing it anyway. And it's very nice for the neighborhood. We get so many people who walk by. And yeah, it's been great. So
Did the turkeys from the gas station at Marin and San Pablo go over there?
well, there's little, I don't know what you call the group of turkeys, but they're all over. I live on Madison and Solano, which is a block over from the Buchanan and Marin. And there's 2 or 3 flocks or whatever they're called up on Albany Hill, actually. And then they go walk along the school, and they're very curious because when we're out there painting the mural, they come by. So yeah,
I've been in traffic stopped because of them in the middle of the street.
Yeah.
Along there on Buchanan.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know what, and also, but I see injured ones, so they must get, it's kind of sad, they must get hit once in a while, or maybe it's just a deformity. But
So a friend of ours that lives down in that area also said that they've eaten all of the lizards.
well, the turkeys and snails, I never have snails anymore.
Oh, really? Huh.
So
I wanted to ask, where does oxalis come from? My whole yard is always overtaken by it every spring. And where does it originate?
well, South Africa, and I know Jake Sig, who was working for the San Francisco parks, I think in Golden Gate Park. It was his thing to just get rid of oxalis early on, but he even, Bay Nature featured an article from him in 2015 that he feels that the only way we're going to overcome it is to actually bring over from South Africa, whatever it is that will keep it in check. I think an insect kind of thing. But they'd have to. Do you know anything about that,
Yeah.
Matthew?
It sounds scary.
I don't know the details. No.
Mhm.
But insects have been used a number of times to try and control invasive plants.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. There have been, I mean, one of the better known examples of that is some weevils that were introduced to try with the intention of controlling Canada thistle, bull thistle, and they decided they preferred the native thistles. And so this non-native weevil kind of ignored the non-native thistles and moved over to start eating the native thistles, which were not a problem.
Theory
And
of
then when there were even fewer of those, then the other ones became more of a problem. And so this approach to, I mean, it's often referred to as classical biocontrol. This idea of bringing in a non-native insect that's identified as a pest in the home range. It can work, but it can be really difficult finding an insect that you can be confident that won't go on and cause problems elsewhere.
Well, I
Because
think what
often
part of
you're
what's held,
releasing it from its own predators, so it might be good at a good herbivore at eating a plant you don't want, but it has its own level of predators keeping it in controllable numbers, and you bring it to a new area and it loses that.
Mhm.
And
Well,
you also have the eucalyptus trees in your area that that can be a problem, and one reason for that is that they have very few insects that eat them.
There's very few what?
They've cut
Very
down.
few insects that eat the eucalyptus.
Oh, I see. I have a huge one in front of my house.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have a problem with them on the hill because that's the wintering site. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what's why the eucalyptus are there. We have a lot of regulation for keeping from the fire department, keeping the strips, in the summer pulled away and all, but they're kind of diseased during the drought. They got diseased. So whether we can save that wintering site is going to be interesting. We do have Dr. Stu Weiss, who's working on that.
That's good. No.
Yeah.
Because one of the problems with eucalyptus in the monarch overwintering sites is that it is getting old, and it's naturally aging and prone to a few diseases, and they do drop limbs from time to time, etc., etc. And it's how to replace them and how to have trees that will be of an adequate size in the right locations to become alternative roosting sites for the butterflies as the eucalyptus age out and begin to die.
Yeah.
With the recent storms, there are so many down trees. Do you guys have it over there? I'm in the city, but parks and I can't believe it. How many down trees?
Well, the Panhandle got really
Crazy
hit.
winds.
You've had two fall down in the Panhandle and one in Stern Grove this last week.
Oh, really? Yeah. And it's Stowe Lake and over in Golden Gate Park. I saw at least a dozen. And they'd fallen right over into the lake. Some of them. Yeah.
Well, I think they closed the top of the hill during these atmospheric rivers, which is where you could get hurt in Albany, on Albany Hill if one fell over. They just closed the top because that's where the wind really hits.
One of the UC Berkeley eucalyptus grove trees just fell this weekend.
Wow. Yeah, I worry about here, I don't know if it's the same there, but here we used to own the trees in front of our house that are out by the curb in San Francisco. And they changed the law about 5 years ago. And so the city has them, and I'm really glad because it was a lot to take care of this giant eucalyptus, and it's like the oldest tree on the block. And I was always fighting for it because, it's the oldest tree on the block and it's this enormous tree. But now I'm like, yeah, every time there's a big storm, as you say, occasionally the limb does go, So,
But other trees are falling too. It's not just the eucalyptus.
yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's just, yeah. Well,
Like we
anyway,
were a
thank
few
you.
weeks ago.
Pollinators.
Back to the pollinators.
Well, it's the most crucial. I think it's one of the most crucial issues. It's our food supply, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah. Lots of, no, they touch our lives in ways every day that we don't always recognize, from the blueberries we have on our breakfast, through to the coffee we drink, through to chocolate in the evening, all the way through, not to mention the cotton clothing and sheets that we sleep on, or if you think about the seasons, springtime meadows, summertime berry picking, Halloween scares with pumpkins, all of those things we rely on pollinators for.
If we could just get our government, if we could just get the political will to do these basic important things and let people know how urgent it is. I mean, we're all working toward it, but we need more political will all the time.
There is a national pollinator strategy.
Great.
Which was came out of the Obama administration. It kind of got ignored for 4 years, and hasn't really bubbled back up, it would appear, in the last couple, but it still exists.
A national strategy
Still
out of
in
DC
form.
or
Yeah, out of the White House.
Oh, really? Good.
Yeah,
I should know
about
that.
monarch butterflies and pollinators. And so it is still there, and it's still, it's like so many of the things, it probably doesn't have legal weight, but it kind of has policy implications and helps guide some decisions by agencies. The State Department does have a low profile project putting in pollinator gardens all around the world at their embassies.
Oh, that's good. And how about the UN? Is the UN worldwide kind of? I suppose it would be some part of their sustainable.
I don't think the UN is run by the White House, is it?
No, not at all. I just meant in addition, because I'd love to see a global.
I don't know what the UN is doing, I'm afraid. I mean, various government agencies at federal level, Department of Agriculture obviously is doing a lot of support for pollinator conservation with programs to have habitat on farms. They have more recently an initiative they're calling the People's Gardens, where the Department of Agriculture has actually created some pollinator gardens in high profile locations and then is certifying others in communities all over the place. We have the Fish and Wildlife Service that is managing habitat, supporting work by state agencies, and also oversees Endangered Species Act species and supports the conservation and protection of those particularly rare ones. So, I mean, there are things being done at all sorts of levels, from the highest level in federal government through states and counties and cities. It's just when you also have to manage roads and support public buildings and services, and you're dealing with homelessness and all these other kinds of social issues, pollinator conservation doesn't bubble up very high in the priorities, which I completely understand. I mean, there's some other issues out there that when it comes down to,
of course, but it's our food.
Where do you spend that money? And it does come down to, that means that individuals can do a lot of things. And although it's like with climate change, there really should be top level change and policy transitions and politicians taking this issue seriously. Some do, some don't. We know there's been some change in the last couple of years that's actually fairly profound, some of the things that have been achieved. But there's also things that we can do as individuals, which do add up, may not seem much, but do add up overall. And also, I think sometimes it gives us a sense of control over something. It's like there are so many things that are just kind of existential worries.
Mhm.
And what can we do? Well, there are simple things we can do that will help pollinators, that can, you know, bit by bit, that little grain of sand that will help counter climate change, providing something that will help slow the heating, maybe, or
Providing
provide a
habitat,
place
yeah.
where the wildlife will be able to have some resilience. So yes,
There
there
are
definitely
is
should
it,
be.
I'm sorry.
No. I was just kind of getting to the rambly stage now, so
No.
I should be quiet.
Is France still the only place? There's 5 main pesticides, is it, that are really the most
The
fatal for bees,
neonicotinoids.
and France has outlawed, I know, 5 of the main pollinate.
Yeah, France was one of the first ones to do it, and then it became European Union. There's a ban on these, and it's the neonicotinoids that you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Often just shortened to neonics because it's easier to say. And certainly in Europe, there has been a move. In Britain, which I follow the news there reasonably well. Since Brexit, Britain is trying to roll back those rules, despite the fact they said that they would keep them. But here in the United States, there isn't such a level of protection. There's a different underlying principles behind pesticide regulation in the Europe and pesticide regulation here. In Europe, there's more of a trying to do least harm. You know, it looks like this is going to be bad, so let's not do that before the bad happens. Whereas here in the US, they tend to want to wait until there's evidence of the bad, by which time it's too late.
Yeah.
There's a journalist that has written a book about the crisis, the decline of insects. He's going to speak at.
This is Oliver Millman.
Oh, from The Guardian?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the
I heard him
ESSEC
on.
Museum at UC Berkeley has him. I don't know if it'll be Zoom or whatever, but it's the 4th of May that
Oh,
they're
I'd
going
like
to
to see
feature him, and hoping that his book will be, catch on with the popular reader. So, yeah. What is his name again?
Oliver
Matthew?
Millman, I think. I think it's Oliver Millman. I have a copy of his book, but it's downstairs, so I can't grab it and wave it
I
around.
heard him on Fresh
Okay.
Air or something like that.
Well,
And I was
yeah, I'll
just
find it because it's. I know the
stunned by
date
some
that
of
it's
the
happening
information.
is May 4th.
We should send it out an announcement.
Yeah, well, contact Pete Oboisky, who's the curator at the ESSEC Museum at UC Berkeley, and he'll get you.
Yeah. And his name is Oliver Millman.
Okay.
Great.
And his book was The Insect Crisis.
The museum ESSEC?
ESSIG, ESSEG, it's the Museum of Entomology at UC Berkeley.
Very nice collection of dead Xerces blue butterflies on pins.
They have a lot of good, butterflies and things on pins.
Oh yeah. No, I love museums like that. They're great.
Well, it's
I'm just joking
the
around.
largest collection in the US, and they ship, they loan these out all the time. We have the collection of the Albany Hill butterflies that's there, that was compiled. We just adopted the drawer in their fundraising. They just had their fundraising. And yeah.
I have a rather trivial question to end the session with. Every day after I do Wordle, I do the New York Times spelling bee, and they always feature a picture of a bee. And I was not aware till your talk at how many thousands of bee species that there were. Are you familiar with their pictures, and are they picturing the different species of birds? Do you know about that?
I will have to go track it down. I'll open it on my app and take a look. I have to admit, I do Wordle, but then I stop. Then I normally go off and cook dinner. So
Well, we have reached almost 9 o'clock. We've got about a minute left. If anybody has a burning question, Eric.
So let me say, and I looked up the date of this Wild and Scenic Film Festival with an electrification fair, and it's on April 22nd at the David Brower Center in Berkeley. So come to that.
this day.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew. This has been terrific. And it doesn't have the, how can I say it, the fuzziness of polar bears, but it is so crucial. It is so important in our life to know about the work of the pollinators and the bees and the butterflies and all the insects. So,
And various things that we could do.
right.
Yeah, sure.
And all the positive, practical things that we can all do. So hopefully we will each do something.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice seeing everyone.